Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time over the next couple of hours looking at all sorts of items in the news, but especially ones that aren't necessarily driven by the news cycle. One of the things I enjoy about December usually is that it calms down a little bit and it gives us a chance to talk about some kind of theme issues. Sometimes I can do a teaching, those kinds of things. Of course, with first the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, things don't calm down quite as much in December as they have in the past. This time last year, we were talking about a tax cut. Just a minute, I'm going to be talking about a piece of legislation that passed in the Senate, which will now go back to the House, which has already passed it because there are some changes in the bill. So we'll see if we get some criminal justice reform. But since it is the reason for the season, I thought I might also read from a piece by Todd Starnes about how the Air Force is being criticized for working with the Salvation Army. Really? Yeah, that really is the case. Then, of course, December 19th, which is today, is significant in that 20 years ago today is when the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton. I thought I'd give you just a little bit of a reminder of some of the things that were said back then about how this was foolhardy for the Republicans to do so, given the popularity of Bill Clinton. Keep that in mind as we talk about the fact that there is almost the same level of popularity and approval rating for Donald Trump as there was back then for Bill Clinton. And we were hearing from the press about how stupid this was for the Republicans to do it. And, of course, now we probably will not hear them talk about how stupid it will be for the Democrats to do it, because there's every reason to believe that impeachment proceedings will convene almost the moment after Democrats take control of the House of Representatives. So got a couple of those issues. Some of the articles we've posted on the whole issue of the liberal mind. By the way, I might just mention that our December issue of Outlook, which if you aren't a donor, you should at least ask for a copy of, and maybe even think about being a donor, is called Liberalism versus Leftism. What's the difference? Because I make a distinction based upon some of the material that Dennis Prager's put together, that the left and liberals are different. And Dennis Prager has a piece that we've posted here on Explaining the Left, Part 5. Left versus right is brain versus mind. I want to read that a little bit later, and also go back to some of the other pieces that he's written, as well as the December issue of Outlook, since it is December. Also have one on the death of the liberal arts. If you believe in the liberal arts, you've got to be concerned about what is starting to happen at major universities. And the argument is always, well, this is because of the emphasis on STEM. That is science, technology, engineering, math, all those kinds of things. And part of that is true. But I think our good friend Victor Davis Hanson wrote that part of it has to do with the fact that the way liberal arts is taught in the universities. If you go into a class wanting to study history, and the whole time is a harangue about white, dead, racist, xenophobic, homophobic men that are part of Western culture, you say, I think I'm going to take another course. And if you're in some of the other social sciences, and if indeed even when you're wanting to study the arts or music, instead you research some obscure composer, artist, or whatever, and you ignore the great works of Western culture, after a while you say, I think I just need to go and major in something else. So the death of liberal arts, in large part, he argues, is a self-inflicted action. And so we'll get into that too. A little bit later, I'll probably do this in the third hour, the Slave Bible and our Bible. You know, we now at the Museum of the Bible have a slave Bible. And last time I was there, I didn't see that, but I'm going to make a point when I get back to Washington, D.C., not only go to the Museum of the Bible again, but see if I can get a good picture of it to use, because the point he's making is people look at that and say, oh, isn't that amazing? People in the 18th and even early part of the 19th century, they just so constructed a Bible so that they wouldn't feel guilty about slavery. And while I completely agree with that, he then goes on in a piece talking about how we have all sorts of now politically correct Bibles and women's studies Bibles and all sorts of other things, as well as just a complete blinder to, let's say, 60 million abortions and some other things. So we've got a lot to cover. And speaking about the issue of abortion, I posted this particular article, which we'll get to later. The actress in Unplanned has quite a story. This movie is coming out in March. And then afterwards, after I posted, I actually was able to see the video of the interview with her. So we'll have a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. And so I hope you'll stick with us as we talk about some of the topics that we've put on the table. Let me get to the first piece of legislative news. And that is, if you have been listening to Point of View, you've heard us talk about what's called the First Step Act. And we've had a number of individuals on the program talking about the pros and cons of it. Well, the Senate voted yesterday 87-12 to actually approve what is called the First Step Act. And it is a perfect example of what we need more of, bipartisan legislation. I mean, you had individuals like a conservative like Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa, certainly a liberal like Dick Durbin, another very strong conservative, Mike Lee from Utah, and another liberal, Spartacus himself, Cory Booker from New Jersey. And so this has been a bill that a lot of individuals on both sides of the aisle have agreed with. Now, to be fair, Tom Cotton and a few others have had some questions about that. But again, the goal there was to reduce the number of people in the prisons if they're nonviolent offenders. Now, there have been some concerns about whether or not this would also lead to violent offenders being released, but I think some of the amendments being proposed and even the conference committee might solve some of those issues. And back in May, I might just point out, the House did pass this version of the bill, and that it was really more on some of the reforms having to do with criminal justice. But of course, then you had some of the sentencing guidelines and other things that were added in the Senate, which is why it has to go back to the House. But there's every reason to believe that indeed that will eventually pass. And we can get into more detail, might even spend a little bit of time talking about it on our Friday weekend edition. But I did hear a talk show host make a good point. If you go out and survey people and look at surveys, or if I took this microphone right out now and just talk to people in this building that aren't associated with this program, first of all, do they even know that there is a thing called the First Step Act? I mean, how many, even on the liberal or conservative talk shows, have anybody even been talking about that? We have. We've had a number of people on here as well to talk about that, but how many people even know about it? Second of all, if you had people rate how important criminal justice reform and sentencing reform are to them, I don't think it'd make the top 10. It might make the top 20, but I doubt it. So here you have a piece of legislation that passed in a bipartisan way that really the American people weren't lobbying for. Now, again, Kim Kardashian and a couple others, and of course Star Parker's on the program with us, and some have been advocating for it, but not many. By contrast, we're told right now that Congress can't even come up with $5 billion to build a wall. Now, are there a few people that have been calling for that? We've elected candidates, including the President of the United States, on that particular issue, and yet we can't even seem to agree to pass that very simple amount of money, or in order to essentially avoid what could be a shutdown by Friday. I don't think we're going to have a shutdown, but it just shows you sometimes the issues that pass aren't even the ones the American people are calling for. This is a good piece of legislation, but there are some others that are even higher priority that are still stuck in Congress. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and so I thought we might reflect on the hymn, O Holy Night by John Dwight. O holy night, the stars are shining brightly. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. Jesus came into the world to save us, and so we feel valuable and our souls feel its worth. Perhaps the most quoted verse in the Bible is John 3:16. It tells us that Jesus came because God so loved the world. He came so that our souls would feel their worth to God. This hymn also asks us to consider the fact that the King of Kings was born as a human infant and placed in a manger. The King of Kings lay thus in lowly manger, in all our trials born to be our friend. He knows our need, to our weakness is no stranger. Behold your King, before him lowly bend. Isn't it amazing that there were some who were willing to worship him, even while merely a babe in the manger? This hymn then now talks about how we should respond to one another in humility. Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love, and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. You know, we no longer have slavery in this country, but it is true that many people are still enslaved to various forms of sin and need Jesus as their Savior. And we as believers are to model the humility that Jesus demonstrated when he stepped out of eternity into time and gave up his rights as God. This is a message we not only need at Christmas, but every day. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Wednesday, December 19th, and I thought it just might remind some of you that are a little bit older what was happening 20 years ago. And on December 19th, 1998, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton on 2 counts of perjury to a grand jury and obstruction of justice. Now, back then, even around the round table here, Marlon Maddox was here, Penna Dexter was here, I was here, John Clements, I know a number of us said, this really doesn't make a great deal of sense because, after all, we know that, yes, you probably could get the votes for an impeachment in the House, but being impeached does not mean removal from office because then now it goes to the Senate, and you have to now get the Chief Justice, who has better things to do, to convene a court. And you know that you're not going to get the requisite number of votes to remove him from office. And so all it's going to do is be a lot of political theater and really prevent any kind of meaningful legislation or even consideration of some very important judicial matters from being considered. Well, here we go again, because I think you have all the reason to believe that there may be impeachment proceedings next year against Donald Trump for even less of the issues that at least Bill Clinton did, because I do agree, and I think everybody would agree, at least to this point, that he was indeed guilty of perjury before a grand jury and later lost his law license. So nobody has any disagreement with that fact. Obstruction of justice, oh yeah, I think we had a few examples of that, not just on that particular case, but some others. But nevertheless, I think it for just a minute might be helpful to remind everybody, and this comes from our good friends there at Newsbusters. I'm only going to read 3 of them because it's a really long article. But Nevertheless, on the Late Late Show, Tom Snyder, that goes back 20 years, doesn't it, discussed the impeachment with historian Douglas Brinkley, who's pretty liberal, and, of course, Eleanor Clift, who at that time was with the Newsweek. And after Clinton complained about Republicans ignoring the polls, Snyder retorted, "I love it when these guys say, we know the American people don't want to do this, but we have to answer the call of the Constitution because we're great patriots. They're morons, for God's sake." So that was what was being said about Republicans pushing forward the idea of impeachment. Then you have the McLaughlin Group, which existed back then, in which you had liberals and conservatives. But one of the liberals was Eleanor Clift, who said, frankly, if the Republicans want to go ahead and do this, I think they disgrace themselves in a more profound way than President Clinton has by abusing the machinery of impeachment, knowing full well that the Senate will hold a sham trial and they will be, in effect, delivered of this ridiculous conclusion they've come to. And so, again, some of the advice being given at the time saying you don't want to do this. And then after CBS Evening News anchor Dan Rather touted the approval rating of President Clinton at the time, contrasting that with the unfavorable rating of the Republicans at that time, then reporter Wyatt Andrews picked up, "The jury in America has reached its decision. The president is on trial. The Republicans have been found guilty." And again, think about this. What's the approval rating right now of any member of Congress, especially the Democratic member of Congress? Well, we can see that as well. And so, again, Andrews relayed how the CBS poll found that 63% believe Republicans acted mostly to damage Bill Clinton, while only 34% said that they acted mostly because the charges were serious. He says what happened is a severe Republican backlash, the worst GOP rating recorded in 14 years. So we probably could learn some lessons from history. That is, if we taught history, because a little bit later I'm going to talk about the fact, I love this line, the liberal arts weren't murdered, they committed suicides. We'll get into that a little bit later in the next hour. But nevertheless, just want to remind you what was happening 20 years ago, and those were the impeachment proceedings, which, as all of us around the table said back then, are going to go nowhere. And even the liberal media was saying it's a really significant, maybe the best word would be fool's errand for the Republicans to pursue that. We'll see what they say when Democrats want to pursue it in just about a month. But let's go on to something else. First of all, if you haven't been paying attention, Salvation Army is way behind. Now, you can decide whether you want to support Salvation Army or not, but I thought I'd point out the fact that for all sorts of reasons, Salvation Army is having difficulty bringing in the kind of money that they've been able to come in for in the past. There are a couple of reasons. I'm not going to go into all that because I really want to talk about the attack on the Air Force for helping the Salvation Army. But the Salvation Army's biggest issue is that in a down economy, then people oftentimes are quite willing to work at what essentially is, almost like minimum wage to ring those bells. But in an up economy where the unemployment's so low, they really have had to depend on volunteers. And if you've walked around a little bit, you know that you've walked into a number of stores and never seen a Salvation Army kettle because they just don't have enough volunteers. So that's another whole issue. But Todd Starnes been on the program with us before. Air Force attacked after volunteers partner with Salvation Army to help needy families. Just got to read this one before we take a break. And this comes from the people that we talk about every once in a while called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. This is Mikey Weinstein. And when Kelly Shackelford has been on with us or Michael Berry has been on with us of First Liberty, they always like to point out that although Mikey Weinstein sounds like this is a really big, huge organization called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, he runs the organization out of his mother's home. Okay, that just gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're dealing with here. But nevertheless, Todd Starnes puts it this way. The Military Religious Freedom Foundation has engaged in some pretty despicable behavior over the years, from demanding that the baby Jesus be removed from military bases to complaining about Bibles on missing man tables, all of which we've talked about in the past. But the latest one happens up there in North Dakota. And I've been in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and for those of us listening up there in that area, I would say it's pretty cold, but nevertheless, the recent attack is on the airmen at the Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. And he said it's so outrageous that even the Grinch is wondering, dude, What the heck? Okay, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation is infuriated because airmen were encouraged to volunteer with the Salvation Army to hand out food baskets and gifts to families in need. So they weren't volunteering to collect the money, which is still an issue for the Salvation Army. But would you like to then have an opportunity to hand out these gift bags and food baskets to these needy families? You know, kind of like almost every NFL player has done in the last couple of weeks here. Nevertheless, here we go. And he said he was contacted by some military personnel who felt humiliated or oppressed by the invitation to assist the Salvation Army. And again, Weinstein said, I have no issue with the Salvation Army per se, as the total fault lies with the Air Force commanders who effectively ordered their subordinates to assist the Salvation Army. And he says the Salvation Army is not at fault in this scenario. Okay. If you've been in the military or been around people in the military, you know when sometimes they say, okay, we need volunteers, you, and you. I didn't feel like that was volunteering. So I recognize that there may be an issue there. But nevertheless, it was not that forced because from what we understand, the Air Force commanders sent out an invitation to volunteer and actually wanted to just encourage them to do that. And so Mickey Weinstein says this is ripping asunder good order, morale, discipline, unit cohesion, because after all, Salvation Army has kind of a biblical perspective. And of course, Mikey Weinstein does not like that. Now, he says to their credit, it appears the Air Force Base has pretty much ignored Weinstein's Scrooge-like rantings. They did not respond to calls regarding the story. First Liberty Institute jumped to defend not only the Air Force Base, but also the airmen who volunteered for the Salvation Army's Christmas event. And so we have First Liberty attorney Michael Berry's been on the program with us saying, such participation is not only permissible, but it is consistent with the highest standards of the Air Force mission. And so if nothing else, that's the response that First Liberty gave to this. First Liberty also, according to Todd Starnes, rightly noted that the Military Religious Freedom Foundation's complaint is unfounded, unsupported by law as well as by military regulations. And then Michael Berry goes on to say the Constitution does not prohibit active duty service members, reservists, or the Department of Defense employees from voluntarily participating in community service events with the Salvation Army. And military regulations clearly point out that volunteer service is permitted so long as there is no Department of Defense endorsement of any non-federal entity. So Michael Berry goes on to say, excluding the Salvation Army purely because of its religious identity and character sends the wrong message and exhibits the kind of anti-religious hostility against which the Constitution guards. The attorney pointed out that the Salvation Army is a well-known faith-based community service organization that is held in the utmost regard. And just one more comment from Michael Berry. Indeed, the Salvation Army, whose motto is doing the most good, meets the high standards required for inclusion in the combined federal campaign. And if nothing else, he says the demands certainly that would exclude you from that certainly defy logic. So I guess you can end all of that with bah humbug. We'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
When the going gets tough, paralysis can be deadly. You look around, you see all kinds of challenges and problems. Our country is greatly divided, red versus blue. At moments like this, the future belongs to those who trust in God and don't just complain and fret, but do something to make a difference. That's the spirit that has sustained Point of View Radio for over 45 years. People who saw difficult problems but recognize this ministry as a tool to equip people to make the right, bold moves. You make possibility reality. And when you give now, a generous friend has promised to double your gift up to at least $50,000. Whatever you give becomes twice as much. But nothing times nothing is nothing, so give generously. Investing is fast and easy online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't let paralysis kill us. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you kind of an advance notice. About a half an hour from now, we're going to have Scott Phillips on for just a little bit. He's going to be talking about why young Christians need to see Israel for themselves. And I just might mention that we're going to be talking about a program that he's put together so that college-age students can go to Israel. And that, I think, is very important rather than waiting until they're the age of many of us that sit around this table to eventually go to Israel for the first time, because it is such a significant issue. I might just mention that if you're not aware, we are going to be having another trip to Israel next October. This one will be to Israel and to Rome this time. Last time we went to Israel and Greece. But again, it gives you an opportunity to walk where Jesus walked, walk where Paul walked in Rome. And for those of you that maybe have been to Israel before, we will actually have two buses, and we're going to have a bus for people that have been there before and go to some different places. I know already we've got plans to go into Magdala, Megiddo, and a variety of other places that normally you tend not to go to if you get on an Israel tour, or even if you've been with us before. So that's the first thing. Number two, because we break it up, you can go to Israel or Israel and Greece. The Israel cost is so much lower. I've even asked other people, well, what did you pay when you went? And then I tell them ours, and they go, well, how do you do this? Well, again, we do actually stay in a kibbutz when we're at the Sea of Galilee, which is just like staying at a Christian camp and just a lot more fun, I think. And we figured out some ways. Plus, we just don't have this entourage carrying around here that I have to pay for. And so in some respects, we recognize that's another issue. I've run into many people over the years say, I would love to go to Israel. I just don't know how I can afford it. Sometimes I can't afford the week off. But again, we do this in 1 week, and it's going to take longer than a week to go to Israel and to Rome. But if you just said, I just want to go to Israel, especially if you say, I even have air miles and I can get there, you won't believe how inexpensive it is. And so you can go to our website, the Take Action button that says Go to Israel with Kerby Anderson, and you can find out a little bit more. We'll be talking with him about how if you have a college student that would like to go, that obviously doesn't have the financial resources, this is, I think, a great ministry that they've got as well. So we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But one of the articles I've posted here is by our friend Dennis Prager. It's entitled Explaining the Left, Part 5. Matter of fact, I have in front of me here all 5 parts of his commentary that he's been running over the last few months. This one, Left versus Right, is brain versus mind. But before we get to it, recognize that he is really talking about a difference, which we talk about in this December issue of Outlook, which we make available to our donors, the difference between liberals and leftists. Now, I never really thought about it because I sort of tended to see the two as the same. But his argument is that there are some real differences. And I'll just give you an example or two. You know, leftists and liberals have a very different view about race, for example. The traditional liberal position on race is the color of one's skin is insignificant, right? By contrast, leftists argue that the notion of race is itself insignificant, is itself racist. And so in some respects, while you had liberals committed to the idea of racial integration, I think many of them would have rejected what they see today in terms of the idea of having separate black graduations, black dormitories, and the rest. Free speech is a perfect example. Your classic liberal would say, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Famous quote, of course. Leftists today are some of the leading candidates in the suppression of free speech everywhere, on college campuses, on big tech companies, and the rest. And one of the examples Dennis Prager uses, which I have in our article here, which gets us back to the superheroes. Never really thought about this, but the idea of nationalism. Dennis Prager says liberals have always believed in the nation state and national pride and the rest, whereas by contrast, leftists oppose nationalism and promote class solidarity. And the example Dennis Prager uses is the Superman comics. Many of us remember when Superman was known to say that he fought for truth, justice, and the American way. You cannot imagine a politically correct Superman today in the comics saying something like that. As a matter of fact, the left-wing writers for the Superman comics, and I did not know this until Dennis Prager pointed it out, had Superman announce a few years ago that he was going to speak before the United Nations and inform them that he was renouncing his American citizenship. So I think it shows a little bit different, and that brings us back to the Dennis Prager article that we've posted today. It is the first one. I've entitled it Liberals, Brain versus Mind. Dennis Prager says it this way: when I talk to young people, I try to offer them what I was offered when I was their age, but relatively rarely is offered today, and that is wisdom. I was given wisdom largely because I went to a religious school. He talks about some of that, and it was a long day and all the rest. But he said with the increasing secularization of society, less and less wisdom has been conveyed to young people. One particularly obvious example is the most secular people, especially on the left, believe human beings are basically good. It is difficult to overstate the foolishness of this belief, and a belief it is. There's no evidence to support it, and there is overwhelming evidence, like virtually all of human history, to refute it. Jewish and Christian kids who study the Bible know how morally flawed human nature is by the age of 10. Another thing I tell young people, which if they take seriously will make them immeasurably wiser and finer, happier, and more productive, is that life is a daily battle between the brain and the mind. Now, before I go any further, let me just point out, as we did the other day when we had J. Warner Wallace on, most atheists and most evolutionists don't believe there's a mind. So they only believe there's just a brain. So they don't even believe in the idea of a mind or anything else. But the point he makes is if you accept that view, which I do, and I think the Bible teaches, and really neurophysiology even informs, then you recognize there's a distinction between your brain and your mind. Here's an example that he uses. The brain wants an ice cream sundae. The mind knows too many sundaes will make a person overweight and eventually diabetic. In the same way, the brain, especially that of a male, wants sex with anyone it finds attractive. The mind knows the trouble doing so will likely lead to. The brain is instinctive and feelings-based. The mind is thoughtful and can be reason-based. And he says, tragically, since the 1960s, the brain, that is, feelings and instincts, have been valued far more than the mind. That explains why for 40 years, he says, I have asked high school seniors which they would save first if both were drowning, their dog or a stranger. And only a third have voted to save the stranger. The reason? They love their dog, not the stranger. The brain over mind, feelings over thought, not to mention transcendent values. And so here's kind of the argument he's making. In some respects, individuals that have accepted this idea of following their feelings and following their brain and not using their mind end up with, again, kind of a leftist point of view. But here's how he says it. On the most important issue in human life, determining what is right and wrong, the brain, that is feelings, has triumphed over the mind, reason, and values. At least 2 generations of Americans have been raised not with moral instruction, but with the question, how do you feel about it? Almost every left-right disagreement in American life can be explained by the brain-mind conflict. The brain is led by what feels good, the mind by what does good. The leftist positions feel good, but of course it feels good to allow anyone who wants to enter America to do so. But if America is worth preserving, the mind understands that the right policy cannot be determined by feelings. If it feels good to keep expanding government so it can provide more and more people with benefits, but the mind recognizes that this is a recipe for disaster because people become addicted to benefits and because the government assumes greater and greater debt it will not be able to repay. It feels good to lower admission standards to enable more blacks to enter prestigious colleges, but the mind knows that it doesn't help blacks. On the contrary, it hurts many of them, as it does students of any ethnicity and race, who are not prepared for the academic demands of prestigious colleges. And one of the oldest and most fundamental Jewish teachings, he said, is that each human being has 2 competing impulses. One that is a Hebrew word, the impulse to do good, the other Hebrew word, which is the impulse to do bad. He said, when I was a young man, one of the leading rabbis of the last generation, Rabbi Wolf Kilman, told me something that changed my life. He said, Dennis, I have become pretty good at keeping would it be the impulse to do bad in check, but it's my impulse to do good that gets me in trouble. Even when propelled to do good, we cannot be guided by feelings. He says it's not only the human being that is driven by the conflict between feelings and reason, so is America. So I've posted that particular article. It is the fifth in a series that he has written. Some of the earlier ones looked at trying to explain America, the whole issue of religion and secularism. Even when we come back, I'll read one about how, in many cases, the left has contempt for middle-class values, which is illustrated again by the difference between the brain and the mind. If you'd like to read some more about this, let me just mention again the December issue of Outlook, Leftism and Liberalism. What's the difference? Distinguishing between radically different political positions. And you might get a copy. It's available right here at Point of View. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Maybe it's the relentless ringing, the high-pitched clinging, or just the reminder that there's something to this season beyond ourselves, but some find the bell ringing a little annoying. At the end of the day, though, the Salvation Army bell ringers do good work. That's probably why Connecticut State Senator George Logan rings the bell outside of a Walmart in Naugatuck, Connecticut each year. This would be an otherwise forgettable act of kindness, except that one atheist group took their annoyance to a whole new level. They sent him an angry Christmas letter. But the letter was less concerned about the bell ringing and more upset that he would dare support an ostensibly religious charity. Rather than support what the group considers a, quote, church denomination, it strongly argued that Logan should focus his attention exclusively on secular charities. This, the group suggests, would solve any appearance of promoting religion and, quote, prevent citizens from feeling ostracized by their elected representatives. Well, if it's not clear to you, let me explain that the law does not require any elected official during his personal time to serve only secular charities. Indeed, the Constitution protects the right of every citizen, elected or not, to serve the charity or house of worship of his choice. The galling bigotry that this organization has evidenced toward the free exercise of this citizen is appalling, especially at Christmas. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I might just mention, those of you that listen online just heard the commentary by Jeremy Dice, who, by the way, will be with us on Friday, along with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter. And he was talking about the Salvation Army, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, we will play that a little bit later. Let me just give you a little bit of an update. In just a few minutes, we're going to be talking at the top of the hour with Scott Phillips, and he is the Executive Director of Passages. and an individual that is really trying to encourage young people to go to Israel. And so we'll talk about that. We have an article related to that. And then we'll move on to some of the issues in the news. We'll come back to talking about this First Step Act, which was passed. Also, one that we've already put a little bit on the table, the brain versus mind in terms of liberalism, trying to understand the liberal mind. We'll get into Liberal Arts Weren't Murdered, They Committed Suicide by Victor Davis Hanson, the Slave Bible and Our Bible, an actress that was in and is in this upcoming movie called Unplanned. And then I'll get into a couple of other issues which I thought were very interesting as well, because we now have learned a little bit more about what was happening in that shooting that took place in Florida. Fascinating that now we recognize there were a number of officers who decided not to go into the Stoneman Douglas High School, and also a judge ruling that cops and the school had no duty to protect Parkland students from the shooting, which shouldn't surprise you if you looked at other rulings in that regard. So we just got a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. But let me just finish off the points we've made on the issue of the difference between leftists and liberals. Some of the liberals we've even sometimes had on this program certainly hold to that kind of classical liberalism, but that has changed very much as the left is sort of taken over. And I read just a minute ago part 5 from Dennis Prager. I thought for just a minute I'd read part 4 because it answers one of the questions that might have come to your mind. Because just a minute ago when I was reading from Dennis Prager, he talked about how we want to lower admissions standards so that we can help more, in this case, African Americans enter school. You might say, well, is that a good or bad thing? You're making it sound like it's bad. And this piece here goes into it in more detail and points out that somebody who actually asked that question found herself in all sorts of trouble. So this is actually kind of part 4 of this series that Dennis Prager has put together, in which he talks about the leftist contempt for middle-class values. And he said, when I was in graduate school, I learned a lot about the left. One lesson was that while most liberals and conservatives abide by society's rules of order and decency, most leftists don't feel bound to live by the same rules. I watched the way leftist Vietnam War protesters treated fellow students and professors. I watched left-wing students make non-negotiable demands of college administrations. I saw the Black Panthers engage in violence, including torture and murder, and be financially rewarded by leftists. He says, today we watch leftist mobs scream profanities at professors and deans and shut down conservative and pro-Israel speakers at colleges. We routinely witness left-wing protesters block highways and bridges, scream in front of the homes of conservative business and political leaders, and surround conservative tables at restaurants while shouting and chanting at them. If that's news to you, haven't been listening to Point of View, because we certainly have documented so much. And he says conservatives don't do these things. They don't close highways, yell obscenities at left-wing politicians, work to ban left-wing speakers at colleges, smash the windows of businesses, etc. So why do leftists feel entitled to do all these things? Dennis Prager says, because they have thoroughly rejected middle-class, bourgeois, Judeo-Christian religious values. Leftists are the only source of their values. Leftists not only believe they know what is right, conservatives too believe they are right, but they also believe that they are morally superior to all others. And so he talks about how they're sort of thinking they're on this high moral plane. They don't consider themselves bound by the normal conventions of civics and decency in society. And so the example he uses is the one I wanted to get into. Just a year ago at the University of Pennsylvania, the law professor there, Amy Wax, wrote a column for the Philadelphia Inquirer in defense of middle-class values. She and her co-author cited a list of what she called behavioral norms that were almost universally endorsed between the end of World War II and the mid-1960s. And so here's her direct quote. Get married before you have children and strive to stay married for their sake. Get the education you need for gainful employment, work hard, and avoid idleness. Go the extra mile for your employer or client. Be a patriot, ready to serve the country. Be neighborly, civic-minded, and charitable. Avoid coarse language in public. Be respectful of authority. Eschew substance abuse and crime. That's a direct quote. Now, you would think that who could, that's like arguing against mom and apple pie, which, by the way, aren't necessarily universally accepted either. She later wrote in the Wall Street Journal the fact that the, quote, bourgeois culture these norms embodied had broken down since the 1960s largely explained what she called today's social pathologies, and embracing that culture will go a long way towards addressing those pathologies. So she really felt that she wasn't necessarily saying anything controversial, but if we want to deal with crime, we want to deal with conflict and chaos, here's the way to go. Well, that list was just too much. Half of her fellow professors of law, that is 33 of them, condemned her in an open letter because she wrote that article. And then Amy Wax wrote in the Journal, my law school dean asked me to take a leave of absence for a year and to cease teaching a mandatory first-year course. The Pennsylvania chapter of the left-wing National Lawyers Guild condemned her for espousing bourgeois values and questioned whether it is appropriate for her to continue to teach a required course. As regards traditional Jewish and Christian codes, Dennis Prager says, just read the left's contempt for Vice President Mike Pence's religiosity. They fear him more than President Trump solely for that reason. One would think that leftists, as sensitive as they are to sexual harassment of women, would admire Pence's career-long policy of never dining alone with a woman other than his wife. On the contrary, they mock him for it. With such high self-esteem and no middle-class bourgeois Judeo-Christian values to guide them, many leftists are particularly vicious people. So then he gives all sorts of examples. Saturday Night Live is one of the examples of some of the awful things that Robert De Niro said at the Tony Awards using the F word with Trump. He goes through then Comedy Central that was where instead of doing the roast of Rob Lowe, who was the target, all the jokes were about Ann Coulter because, well, guess what? She's conservative, and they mocked her looks, which is kind of hard to do, by the way, but that's just a whole nother story as well. And so the point he's making is now you can understand why the left hates Mike Pence, a man who has, by all accounts, led a thoroughly honorable life. He and other evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews tries to live by a code that is higher than him. But nevertheless, he is vilified, and I am amazed at the number of times when sometimes people are very critical about some of the things that Donald Trump does, which I completely agree with. Some of the things he says, some of the things he's done in the past, even the present. And I said, well, would you have those same feelings if Mike Pence were the president? And it certainly catches them off guard because really it helps sort out real quickly that, no, they don't really like the policies. It's just that, of course, Donald Trump gives us a lot to talk about. And I've just been amazed at the number of people that go, well, I don't like Mike Pence either. As a matter of fact, I even have worse. And you begin to realize that it's really about the values, isn't always about the behavior. Now, again, President Trump gives us lots of things to talk about, and we certainly do on a regular basis. But you can see that when you start mocking even a person of high moral standing like Mike Pence, it tells you a lot more about how there's a complete rejection of some of those values. Nevertheless, I wanted you to read that particular piece that is today's issue, or actually came out yesterday by Dennis Prager. The difference between the brain and mind might be the difference between left and right, or at least between leftists and liberals and conservatives. And so just thought I'd post that on the website. When we come back, we're going to talk about Israel and hope that in one way or another you have a chance to visit Israel, if not face-to-face, even vicariously with some of the material we'll post. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend time talking about a lot of different topics. In just a minute, we're going to talk about how, if you know somebody that is in college, would like to go to Israel, how we can do that for them. Of course, we always have and will next October have a tour to Israel and Rome. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just before we get into that conversation, let me just mention that over the next couple hours, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about some legislation that was passed yesterday. Of course, you have what is called the First Step Act, which was passed in the Senate. We've talked about this before. It would be criminal justice reform. It now goes back to the House, which originally had more kind of criminal justice reform, but then there was a lot of additional material added in the Senate about sentencing reform. So we'll talk about that, but it is a classic illustration of what we probably need more of, bipartisan support. 87 individuals in the Senate voted for it, pushed forward by Republicans like Chuck Grassley and Mike Lee, also by Democrats like Dick Durbin and Cory Booker. So we'll talk about the significance of that a little bit later. One of the articles I posted by Victor Davis Hanson, the liberal arts weren't murdered, they committed suicide. And we'll get into that. Also, some material that I think you'll find very interesting about the so-called Slave Owner's Bible, which is up there at the Bible Museum, the Museum of the Bible, and how in some respects we have some of our truncated Bibles today. I'll get into that later. And then we'll also talk about this testimony of an actress who is the lead in Unplanned, which is a story about Planned Parenthood coming out in March. But just an incredible story there. And also, for those of us walking by various malls or stores, haven't seen so many Salvation Army kettles. There's some reason for that, having to do with the fact that we have a very good economy, and so we have fewer people manning those kettles. But in particular, a little bit later, I want to talk about a piece that came out by Todd Starnes and also articulated by Michael Berry, who's with the First Liberty Institute with us, in which the Air Force has been criticized for asking for volunteers to help partner with the Salvation Army. So we've got those conversations. And 20 years ago today, December 19th, 1998, when the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton, I want to give you some comments from some people back then that said this was really a bad idea for the Republicans to do so. Something to remember when the Democrats, as soon as they take power in January, probably want to try to impeach President Donald Trump. So we've got a lot to cover, and we'll do so over the next couple of hours. But first, I wanted to spend just a few minutes, if I could, talking with Scott Phillips. He serves as the executive director of Passages, which is an organization that really will help young Christians have a chance to go to Israel. In the past, he has served as the Midwest Outreach Director for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and an individual that also wrote this piece that we've posted on our website, Why Young Christians Need to See Israel. Scott, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
I've always said that if anybody can make their way to Israel, however they get there, it's going to make a difference. And even last week, we had an individual that I've partnered with before when we've done some of these tours to Israel, who even as a pastor was saying, well, I've been to seminary, I've studied the Bible, what am I going to get out of this? He goes over there and comes back, he said, I'm that guy now telling everybody they got to go. You know, it's like the difference between reading the Bible in 2 dimensions and now reading the Bible in 3 dimensions. It's like reading the Bible in black and white, now it's in color. And so we've always wanted to see if we could have adults go. who could afford to do so. But when I first heard about your program, I said, this would be terrific for a college student. Instead of waiting until they're 30-something, 40-something, 50-something, finally making their way to Israel, you have put together a program that I wanted our listeners to know about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Passages it's an exciting new program. In the Jewish world, there's a program called Birthright, and maybe many of your listeners have heard of the program. But in the Jewish world, this is a program aimed at young Jewish people going to Israel and really discovering their roots, their identity as Jews. And so, for almost 20 years now, you've seen this program thriving in Israel. If you go over there, you see young people from the Jewish community that are part of Birthright trips, and they do, they take almost 50,000 students a year. And so something that, Passages, a few years ago, our founders wanted to put together a program for Christians to be able to go and go to the Holy Land, go to the place where their faith was born, really go and I think discover their own roots as Christians, where it all started, their own identity as Christians. What better place to do that than to go to Israel, where it all started?
Well, again, the Bible refers to Israel about 2,000 times. If you've ever met somebody who has come back from Israel and had a chance to go to the Sea of Galilee, Nazareth, Capernaum, the Garden of Gethsemane, to mention just a few of many places, Masada, the Dead Sea, it puts it all together. And there's a secondary reason that you talk about in this article, and that is the sad reality is the younger you are, the less likely you are to be as sympathetic towards Israel. And a lot of that goes back to a conversation I had even the last hour about how Israel is taught about in the schools and how there has been a push for disinvestment in a number of things. And I think there is a need not only from a biblical point of view, but frankly, a little bit even from a political point of view, to get young people over to Israel and really see what's truly going on.
Yeah, look, I think it's important for people to go and see things for themselves, no matter what it is, versus just taking, any particular media outlet's word for it or what they're hearing on campus, particularly on this issue about Israel, and just really taking students over to really first, strengthen their Christian identity and faith, but also expose them to what's happening in Israel and even the broader Middle East today. Let them meet the people, who live in Israel today, that there is actually a thriving country. We read about it 2,000 times, as we mentioned in the Bible. But there's actually a modern country called Israel, and the people, some of the people that live there are actually called Jews, just like in the Bible. And so, and so we take students over, and they hear from different people from different backgrounds. They hear from, Jewish Israelis, Arab Israelis. They hear from Palestinians. They hear different perspectives on what's happening today, and we really think that's important for them to be able to really, hear for themselves from, the people living on the ground today, different perspectives. And, we tell, the students all the time that, of course, we want to be honest with you. We think Israel's a good place. We hope you do too. But we really want to be non-prescriptive on this trip and offer you different perspectives so that you can, see it for yourself and not just hear from what's being said on campus or in the media.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Scott Phillips for a little bit longer and answer some of your basic questions. By the way, if you can simply go to our website, pointofview.net, you'll see the link, or you can just go to passagesisrael.org. Either way, we'll get you there, obviously. There is a video, and my assignment for you whenever we have a video available. It's about 4 minutes long, and it includes Scott as well as a couple of other people and just a sense of what is taking place there. I would encourage you to watch the video. It's only going to take you a couple minutes. You can almost watch it during the break here. And then hit that share button and maybe post it and let some people know. You'll be surprised at how easy it will be to maybe send some college kids that you know to Israel. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and so I thought we might reflect on the hymn, "O Holy Night" by John Dwight. O holy night, the stars are shining brightly. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. Jesus came into the world to save us, and so we feel valuable and our souls feel its worth. Perhaps the most quoted verse in the Bible is John 3:16. It tells us that Jesus came because God so loved the world. He came so that our souls would feel their worth to God. This hymn also asks us to consider the fact that the King of Kings was born as a human infant and placed in a manger. The King of Kings lay thus in lowly manger, in all our trials born to be our friend. He knows our need, to our weakness is no stranger. Behold your King, before him lowly bend. Isn't it amazing that there were some who were willing to worship him, even while merely a babe in the manger? This hymn then now talks about how we should respond to one another in humility. Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love, and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. You know, we no longer have slavery in this country, but it is true that many people are still enslaved to various forms of sin and need Jesus as their Savior. And we as believers are to model the humility that Jesus demonstrated when he stepped out of eternity into time and gave up his rights as God. This is a message we not only need at Christmas, but every day. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, Scott Phillips will be with us just a little bit longer in case you have a specific question, 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later this hour, we're going to move on to some other topics, and this is always a good time during the Christmas season when things tend to die down a little bit. Of course, we just had a piece of legislation pass the House and now the Senate, and now it's going to go to the House, but some of these other things are topics we sort of like to wait for when there isn't such a pressing news cycle, and that's one of the reasons why we're just thrilled to have Scott Phillips with us, who is the Executive Director of Passages. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Scott, let's give everybody some details. First of all, you're looking for college students with some leadership potential, but give us a little bit more background, because you have an FAQ, you have some testimonies, of course you have an About Us. But as people go to passagesisrael.org, they can find out everything they need to know. But tell us what the program is like, how long it takes, what the costs are, and some of the basics that are going to be important for people.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. So the trip, basically what we do is a lot of times we work, with colleges and universities and partners on those campuses to fill buses from particular schools. But we do have, several buses a year that are multi-school buses, where students can just go on our website and they can, put their name down for the interest list. And, when we have those buses come available, we certainly look at that interest list, and we want as many people to go as possible. As you mentioned, Christian students with leadership potential, those students who, regardless of really, what they're studying, are serious about their faith, their calling, about leadership in general and being leaders in life. And so definitely passagesisrael.org. You can sign up on that interest list. The trip is a 9-day trip. We have trips in the spring, the summer, and the winter, basically anytime school's out. And the trip is actually highly subsidized. It's $750 for the trip. Students can get $200 of that back once they complete the whole program. We think of passages in 3 phases. It's the pre-trip phase where you apply and you sort of take this pre-trip course where you just get, prepared for what's going to happen on the trip and prepared for what you're going to learn on the trip. Then, of course, we have the trip itself, 9 days, focused both on faith and modern issues. And then after the trip, students are required to do 3 things in what we call Passages Now. And that's our alumni engagement program. We just really want students to tell their story about how their trip went. We want them to learn more. We want them to build on the foundation of the trip. And so students can get $200 back after they complete all 3 of those phases. And really that includes their international airfare, lodging, transportation, program fees in Israel, most meals except for just a few lunches. So students do need to get themselves to, the international hub city, so say New York or wherever it may be. But our donors are very, we have, donors from different backgrounds, and they're very generous to be able to subsidize. Obviously, a trip to Israel costs a little more than $750.
That's right. So. But again, let's talk about what they need to commit to. Obviously, they have that pre-trip, so, that's a couple of weeks, 3 to 4 weeks before. And so then they have some things after the trip. But overall, so it's not necessarily just a free vacation. They are participating a little bit, but compared to the kind of demands that we put on a college student, they're going to go, this is nothing compared to what I've had to do for some of these courses. But at the same time, for very little investment financially, they will be able to have an experience that I know every one of our listeners perhaps wishes they could have if they were college students. So that's why I thought it would be kind of fun to have you talk about what has happened. And speak about that for just a minute, because whenever I have somebody on and we talk about a trip to Israel, or we had people call in and say, I went on the trip and this really was life-changing to me, there are some tremendous stories about that. But can you share a few of those? Because after all, you've had a large number of college students make their way to Israel, and I'm sure they've come back with some incredible stories, haven't they?
Absolutely. You're exactly right. And you've, as you mentioned, you've taken people to Israel, and we've seen time and time again with passages, both anecdotally through stories, but also through the surveys that we take after the trip, that it really is, and it sounds cliche, but it is a life-changing experience. We've had students come on the trip who were committed to their faith, but they were, like many of us have had in our faith walk, have had, questions or doubts, or just need God to really speak to us. And whenever we go to the place where our faith was born, where our spiritual heritage exists, we've seen these students come back, recommitted to their relationship with God. Some students, change sort of the trajectory of their careers because they felt God called them, to a specific path while they were in Israel, or even after the trip when they take part in our leadership development programs post-trip. They've really felt God calling them even more into leadership roles in their communities, but also in their future careers. So, these stories are endless of students really having just their faith being reignited, and also their leadership stories begin to be written. We like to see passages. A lot of it is really a leadership development program, and a big part of it is a trip to really the place where their spiritual heritage exists.
Well, again, you go to passagesisrael.org. First of all, we have that link. Of course, there's also a link to a Facebook page as well as the Twitter account. There's a blog there as well. But again, you're talking about a full-time student, probably ages 18 to 30, from what I understand. And again, they have to make a commitment to the pre-trip, which is not huge, but, it's going to be a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, and then a post-response if they are going to be part of that. And so I just think it's something I did not know existed. And as we've said before, there are just so many great opportunities for people to go to Israel. And we've tried to make it as inexpensive as we can for adults. And I'm sure there's some people right now saying, oh, okay, I'm 55. I wish I were 27 again, because then I could go in this program. But I wanted you to know about that. And at the same time, let's talk about a way in which people can maybe promote this to others, because there are some listeners right now that say, well, I can't go, but I know this college student that would probably be very interested. And one of the things I would suggest is if they go to the website there is this video that you put together, which is about 4 minutes, a little bit more than 4 minutes long. I think you and your staff have done a pretty good job in about 4 minutes explaining the program. And so if people watch the video and then share it with somebody or provide a link, that's a good way that they can go out there and get this in the hands of some of these young people that might like to attend and go to Israel next year.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's a great way to do it. Also, we're very active on social media. Obviously, a bunch of millennials, we like social media. So we're our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram handle is @PassagesIsrael. And so, that's a really great way to go and share with, that college student that or with your personal network. We have a lot of great videos on there. We actually have students on the ground right now in Israel. We have 3 buses there, and there's going to be another 15 or 16 or so buses after Christmas. And there's a lot of live updates with students on the ground giving interviews and lots of fun stuff to go and share with others on our social platforms.
So again, I would encourage you to go to the website there for Passages. And Scott, I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View. Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much.
Let's again encourage you to check that out, and let me encourage you to figure out what you can to market that to others. Maybe a college student that might be interested, and price is pretty good. No, we can't do it that well for you as adults, but let me just mention, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, we have under the Take Action section the trip that we'll be taking to Israel next October. Israel will be October 18th to the 27th. Then Rome will be the 27th to the 30th. And again, it's one of those which, like we've done before, you can go just to Israel or to Israel and Rome. And so I wanted you to know about that. We have posted information about the itinerary, what happens each particular day and where we will go, a thing on date and pricing, and there are different ones because it depends on whether you're going to go just to Israel or Israel and Rome. There's also a pricing change. For example, if you have a way of getting over there by yourself, maybe you have miles or something like that, we can connect up with you at the airport. So those are some options for you, and I just want you to begin considering this now. We're, of course, having to make some decisions as well. Buses, tour guides, all the things that necessarily need to take place. And if you're looking for a Christmas present at the last moment, this would be a good one. And I've said before, it's very inexpensive, so there is a reservation form, a PDF form. There's information about insurance, asking some of the frequently asked questions. And as we've said before, if you can get to the place of debarkation, in the case of Passages, that's New York. For those of us going to Israel, it's going to be Toronto, Canada this time. We have some of the cheapest flights possible out of Toronto. So if you can get yourself to Toronto, then the rest is taken care of once you've paid for that trip. So lots to check out. Go to the website, find out more. We've got a lot to cover. We will do that right after this.
When the going gets tough, paralysis can be deadly. You look around, you see all kinds of challenges and problems. Our country is greatly divided, red versus blue. At moments like this, the future belongs to those who trust in God and don't just complain and fret, but do something to make a difference. That's the spirit that has sustained Point of View Radio for over 45 years. People who saw difficult problems but recognize this ministry as a tool to equip people to make the right, bold moves. You make possibility reality. And when you give now, a generous friend has promised to double your gift up to at least $50,000. Whatever you give becomes twice as much. But nothing times nothing is nothing, so give generously. Investing is fast and easy online at pointofview.net or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't let paralysis kill us. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
It is Wednesday, and in just a few minutes, I want to talk about what was happening 20 years ago, December 19th, in this case, 1998, when the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton. That was something even those of us around the table said this makes no sense because at best you'll get an impeachment indictment, but it was not going to actually remove the president from office. It is going to tie up the Senate with all sorts of histrionics and all sorts of political theater. It's going to require the Chief Justice of the United States to convene a actual trial of sorts, which means that nothing is going to happen in the Senate. Nothing is going to happen of any significance in the Supreme Court. It was just a disaster back then. It would be a disaster now, but we'll see. And I just wanted to read a few quotes in just a few minutes to remind us of how the liberal press at that time said this was a disaster. I will wait to see whether or not they're going to remind or tell the Democrats that are thinking about impeaching this current president, whether that would be a disaster, but we'll see where that unfolds. But just before we get to that, let me just mention that one of the more significant legislative actions took place yesterday, in which in the United States Senate, there was an approval of the First Step Act. 87 senators, both Republicans and Democrats, agreed. This is the example that we look for from time to time for bipartisan action. And this is something we've talked about quite often here on the program. Months and months ago, we had Star Parker on to talk about this when it passed through first the House of Representatives. I think that was back in May, if I remember right. And then, of course, we've had Rebecca Hagelin on, who served as the vice president for a time at the Heritage Foundation. We've talked with Kelly Shackelford and Lathan Watts and a number of others. We recognize that some people have been against it, Senator Tom Cotton being an example. But again, this was something that passed first the House of Representatives back in May, and those were primarily criminal justice reforms. And then when it made its way to the Senate, there were some sentencing reforms and mandatory sentence guidelines that were reduced, which requires it now to go back to the House for them to vote essentially for the same bill. And if there are any changes, then there'll be a conference committee. But let's just recognize again, it's rare that you can get these individuals to agree. It was pushed forward by such Republicans as Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa, as well as Senator Mike Lee from Utah. And these are both Republicans, but it also is pushed forward by Democrats like Dick Durbin of Illinois, Cory Booker of New Jersey. And like I said, 87 senators voted for it. So we'll see where it goes, but it's something we've been talking about. But before we go on, let me just mention one kind of point that other talk show mentioned, and that is, isn't it interesting that this is a piece of legislation which we around the table think is important and actually takes some really good reforms that were implemented in the prisons in the state of Texas, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, to give credit where credit is due. But if you were to take a microphone right now outside of this studio and talk to people in the building or out on the street, I guarantee you that most people wouldn't even know there is a First Step Act. If you ask them how important is criminal justice reform, I doubt it would be in the top 10. Might be in the top 20, but I doubt it's going to be in the top 10. And yet, look, this one was pushed through Congress. Now, if you were to go and say, what is one of the big issues for you that might even close down the government by the end of this week? Well, that'd be the building of a wall. And we can't even seemingly get an agreement between Republicans and Democrats on building a wall, which I think most people with any kind of common sense recognize that we need. Right now, they've been refurbishing the wall with these bollard walls we've been talking about. And there's some other places where we certainly do need to build a wall. And you've heard all sorts of criticism. Oh, it's going to cost too much. Really, $5 billion out of a $1.5 trillion federal budget? Be serious. Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, you mean like the walls that we've seen work, for example, in Israel? We're just talking about Israel in just a minute. Oh, well, this is racist. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the fallback position usually. When you can't make an argument out of rationality, then you appeal to emotion. And it just, we can't even get any kind of agreement there. I mean, after all, let's recognize that one of the reasons Donald Trump was elected as president was the wall, wasn't it? I mean, after all, it was some of the individuals serving in Congress right now were elected because they wanted to get a wall. And we can't even get movement on that, and may even close down the government by Friday, Probably not, but nevertheless, it just shows you that an issue that isn't that high a priority for most Americans, which I still think is an important priority, passes with bipartisan support, and another issue which is really important for a lot of Americans doesn't. And I'd love to get your comments about that. 1-800-351-1212. But good news, at least, the First Step Act has passed the Senate. Now that bill will go back to the House. We'll see if we can actually see a piece of legislation that will affect those individuals who are serving in federal prisons that are nonviolent offenders. And so we'll look at that as well. But as I pointed out just a minute ago, 20 years ago today, December 19th, 1998, House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton on 2 counts. One was perjury to a grand jury. The other was obstruction of justice. It wasn't up for debate. Does anybody disagree with the fact that he was guilty of perjury? No, I don't think so. After all, later, Bill Clinton lost his law license over that, so I think we all understand that. Obstruction of justice, same thing. But let's go back and look at the comments from the media warning that this was a really bad idea. The day before the vote on the Late Late Show, Tom Snyder discussing impeachment with a historian, Douglas Brinkley, who is fairly liberal, and Eleanor Cliff, who at that time was with Newsweek, after Clinton had complained that the Republicans were ignoring the polls, then that's when Tom Snyder retorted, I love it when these guys say, we know the American people don't want us to do this, but we have to answer the call of the Constitution because we're great patriots. And Tom Snyder said, they're morons, for God's sake. A week earlier at the McLaughlin Group, this was where you had both Christian and non-Christian Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals mixing it up at different times. But one of the participants, one of the stalwart participants of the McLaughlin Group was Eleanor Cliff, who said, frankly, if the Republicans want to go ahead and do this, I think they disgrace themselves in a more profound way than President Clinton has by abusing the machinery of impeachment, knowing full well that the Senate will hold a sham trial and they will be, in effect, delivered of this ridiculous conclusion they've come to. So again, warning the Republicans, this is a disaster. You don't want to go down that road, but they did anyway. And then finally, Dan Rather, that time it was the anchor of CBS Evening News, pointing out that at that time, President Clinton had a very significant approval rating. And as a result, the Republicans had a much lower approval rating. Well, fast forward to today, I'll guarantee you the approval rating of Donald Trump is much higher than the approval rating of any member of Congress, including the Democrats. And as a result, the reporter Wyatt Andrews picked up, the jury in America has reached the conclusion. The president is on trial. The Republicans have been found guilty. And then a little bit later, after they talked about another poll, they talked about again that this is actually going to lead to a severe Republican backlash because they had their worst Republican rating recorded in 14 years. Don't disagree. At the time, we talked about that as a disaster that it was back then, in the sense that, sure, it established that the president indeed was guilty of some of this, but it took up an enormous amount of time, first in the House, then on the news, then in the Senate, which, as I said, almost nothing was happening in the Senate because they actually had to convene sort of a trial in the U.S. Senate, and you had to have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court preside over it, which means any meaningful pieces of legislation weren't passing the Senate, which means any important judicial decisions that would require the Chief Justice could not be rendered. It just was something that made no sense. And, of course, the Republicans did pay a price for it. And, of course, right now, as you may be well aware, there are quite a number of Democrats that want to hold impeachment hearings in the House as soon as they take control. And as they do so, we'll see whether or not they pursue that to an actual vote. The base would like it. But I think there are many Democrats that are saying, let's not, if anything, let's learn a lesson from history. This didn't work well for the Republicans in the past. It's not going to work well for the Democrats in the present. And yet we'll see where that all takes us. We come back from the break. I want to deal with a couple of issues. First of all, Salvation Army. Our good friend Todd Starnes, as well as Michael Berry, who's been on the program with us before, point out that Guess we should have expected it. The Military Religious Freedom Foundation upset that some people in the Air Force are helping the Salvation Army. So we'll talk about that and then get into a couple of other stories that have come out in the news that, again, some really significant surprises. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Maybe it's the relentless ringing, the high-pitched clinging, or just the reminder that there's something to this season beyond ourselves, but some find the bell ringing a little annoying. At the end of the day, though, the Salvation Army bell ringers do good work. That's probably why Connecticut State Senator George Logan rings the bell outside of a Walmart in Naugatuck, Connecticut each year. This would be an otherwise forgettable act of kindness, except that one atheist group took their annoyance to a whole new level. They sent him an angry Christmas letter. But the letter was less concerned about the bell ringing and more upset that he would dare support an ostensibly religious charity. Rather than support what the group considers a, quote, church denomination, it strongly argued that Logan should focus his attention exclusively on secular charities. This, the group suggests, would solve any appearance of promoting religion and, quote, prevent citizens from feeling ostracized by their elected representatives. Well, if it's not clear to you, let me explain that the law does not require any elected official during his personal time to serve only secular charities. Indeed, the Constitution protects the right of every citizen, elected or not, to serve the charity or house of worship of his choice. The galling bigotry that this organization has evidenced toward the free exercise of this citizen is appalling, especially at Christmas. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we put on the table whether or not the president should be impeached, if you have some comments about that. Also, one about the Salvation Army. Those of you listening online actually just heard a commentary that was done by Jeremy Dice, who, by the way, will be with us on Friday, along with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, on a Salvation Army case different than the one we're going to talk about right now, because the Military Religious Freedom Foundation has engaged, as Todd Starnes says in his article, in some pretty despicable behavior. They talk about from everything from demanding the baby Jesus be removed from military bases to complaining about Bibles on missing man tables. But the most recent attack takes place up there in Grand Forks Air Force Base in Grand Forks, North Dakota. I've been there before, and for those of you up there, I know how cold you are right now, and I've been there during the winter, so I can relate to that. But nevertheless, he says, this is at least Todd Starnes says, that the attack on the airmen there at Grand Forks Air Force Base is so outrageous, even the Grinch is wondering, dude, what's going on? Because the Military Religious Freedom Foundation is upset that airmen were encouraged to volunteer with the Salvation Army to hand out food baskets and gifts to families in need. By the way, I've mentioned in passing in the past that the Salvation Army is really behind in their contributions. And whether you want to contribute or not, it's really interesting why. And that is there are fewer people that actually can be actually working at essentially what's minimum wage. So they've had to depend on volunteers. There aren't as many volunteers. And if you noticed, as you maybe go into a store or a mall, you haven't seen so many red kettles. So it's made it even more significant. But this is not asking the people in the Air Force to collect money. It's just asking whether some of those individuals in the Air Force would like to deliver these food baskets and gifts. You know, kind of like almost every NFL athlete has been doing over the last couple of weeks, you know, and all the other things in Toys for Tots and all the other things that have been taking place right now. Well, Mickey Weinstein, who's the founder of the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, says he doesn't really have a problem with Salvation Army per se, but with the commanders who sent out an invitation asking for these people to volunteer. Now, the argument Weinstein says is, well, you know what it's like when they talk about volunteering in the military. You know, I need 3 volunteers, you, and you. But that's not the way it was. This was an opportunity, if they wanted to do that. And, of course, Mickey Weinstein is just whining about the fact that this has ripped asunder good morals, good order, discipline, unit cohesion, and all that kind of stuff. But apparently, at least according to Todd Starnes, the Air Force has pretty much ignored some of the Scrooge-like rantings of Mickey Weinstein. But I thought it'd be good to hear from our friends at First Liberty, and Michael Berry's been on the program with us many times before. He's part of their military division there at First Liberty, and he said such participation is not only permissible, but is consistent with the highest standards of the Air Force mission. Even talked about the fact that the complaint is unfounded and unsupported by, first of all, the Constitution and military regulations. Again, quoting Michael Berry, he said, the Constitution does not prohibit active duty service members, reservists, or Department of Defense employees from voluntarily participating in community service events from the Salvation Army. And he goes on to say that military regulations, you know, clearly point out that volunteer service is permitted, at least as long as it's not in some conflict with the Department of Defense or seen as an endorsement as well. Michael Berry said excluding the Salvation Army purely because of its religious identity and character sends the wrong message and exhibits the kind of anti-religious hostility against which the Constitution guards. He says, indeed, the Salvation Army, whose motto is doing the most good, meets the high standards required for inclusion in what he calls the Combined Federal Campaign, which is, again, the giving program of the federal government. And he says the demands that come from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation that you exclude such an organization from voluntary community service is purely because of its religious identity defies logic. So anyway, Todd Starnes closes by saying, I've got a couple words for all this, bah humbug. And that's kind of where we find ourselves in terms of the Salvation Army issue. Might return to it back on Friday when we get into some of the religious liberty issues. But just before we take a break, one of the other very important decisions coming down has to do with this lawsuit that was filed on behalf of a number of students who were part of the shooting that took place at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And I think it illustrates a point that we've made on Point of View before. A federal judge says that the Broward schools and the sheriff's office had no legal duty to protect students during the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. U.S. District Judge Beth Bloom dismissed a suit filed by 15 students who claimed they were traumatized by the crisis in February. The suit names 6 defendants, including the Broward School District and the Broward Sheriff's Office, as well as School Deputy Scott Peterson and Campus Monitor Andrew Medina. Now, first of all, let me just say that even though we wish that there would be some way to hold people accountable, I do agree with the idea that we just cannot say that if the police showed up too late at your home, that you could sue them because they were late. I mean, the police cannot be told that they have a duty to protect every individual. They just simply cannot do that. If you're in custody, that's a different issue. And of course, we recognize that as well. But I thought it was also kind of intriguing because just as this came out, this story came out about the fact that it wasn't just Scott Peterson. Let me just read this story real quickly. In the weeks after a deadly school shooting in Parkland, Florida, widespread criticism focused on Scott Peterson, who was named in the suit, the armed sheriff's deputy who heard the exploding gunfire but failed to run in and try to stop the massacre. But a state commission that has been investigating since the February 14th attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School for the past 10 years found that the shortfall in the police response went much further. 7 other sheriff's deputies who raced to the school and heard gunshots also stayed outside the building, the commission found, and officers lost even more time scrambling to retrieve bulletproof vests from their cars. And so as a result, of course, a terrible shooting that took place, of course, in February. But first of all, the ruling from the judge and now the latest report from the investigation just illustrates a point that we've made before. We can't keep saying that the police have to protect everyone. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the ability to do so. And even if indeed they are giving a very prompt response, you've heard me say time and time again, when seconds count, the police are just minutes away. And so this, I think, brings us back to the fact that even though there was a desire on the part of some of these students to sue all sorts of individuals, the school district, the sheriff's office, even some individuals like Scott Peterson, now we find out it was more than just Scott Peterson, sometimes you have to be responsible for your own defense. And so it was not surprising to me that then the decision came down that at least at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, they would allow teachers, if they wanted to do so, to arm themselves. Love to get your comments on that. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we might take a few calls before we get into some other issues. One of those is an article I've posted today about the liberal arts weren't murdered, they committed suicide. Why is it now schools are starting to drop majors in liberal arts? It's not so much just because of an emphasis upon STEM curriculum, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, although that's part of it. It's also due to just the kind of harangues that take place in some of the college classrooms when you take some of these liberal arts courses. So we'll talk about that. Upcoming movie called Unplanned, talking about Planned Parenthood, and the actress in there found out some interesting stories there, and a lot more that we will try to cover in this next hour. But if you'd like to join us at any point, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we want to talk about a number of issues ranging from abortion to slavery to the liberal arts and a couple of others. One of the things I do love about the time as we get closer to Christmas is that sometimes there aren't as many news stories, although this last hour we certainly talked about a few. A judge's decision on an issue, legislative issue that was just voted on in the United States Senate, and a couple of others. But we're kind of looking ahead to 2019, and one of those is this movie called Unplanned. Now, this is the story of Abby Johnson, and Abby Johnson's been on this program with us, and if you're not familiar with her story, she headed up a Planned Parenthood clinic, was a very strong pro-abortion advocate who then became pro-life, and has really kind of removed the guard, if you will, some of the veneer of what happens in a Planned Parenthood clinic. Well, nevertheless, I wanted to, and one of the articles we've posted is post this story by Ashley Bratcher. Now, since I was able to post the story, I've actually watched the interview with her and learned a few more things. So as we go through this article, I'm going to digress from time to time because I know a little bit more of the story. But it is interesting because she was actually the individual who auditioned and now has played Abby Johnson in this story that will be out in March. And we will definitely be promoting Unplanned quite a bit because it will tell the story not only about abortion, but Planned Parenthood and the pro-life story and everything else. Fascinating. But anyway, Ashley Bratcher, in the article we've posted here, just came out a couple days ago, said, "I've always considered myself pro-life, but certainly not an activist. I had no idea who Abby Johnson was when I first auditioned to play her in the biopic Unplanned. I was given just 6 pages that ignited my curiosity." Now, let me tell the backstory that she doesn't tell here, but you can maybe see in some of the interviews. The producers of the program, of the movie, were afraid that they wanted people to make a decision very quickly, do the film before they got talked out of it. They fully realized that some people, if they tell their parents what they were doing or their friends, they'd say, "Oh, you don't want to do that." And they even warned Ashley, this could be a career ender, because once you appear in a pro-life film that I believe is going to get a lot of exposure and a lot of press, she may become the darling of Christian movies, but that may be the end of her in Hollywood. So that was part of it. So that's why she only had 6 pages and then was flown. I think, didn't they take her to, I think it was Oklahoma, Kansas. I forget exactly where she was. Anyway. And then she said, there was something about Abby that struck me. She said, how could this incredibly passionate woman one day change her mind about everything she believed in? She said, there is more to the story. So she said, within hours of auditioning for the movie Unplanned, I had Googled every article and YouTubed every video I could find about Abby Johnson. She says, what I found left me in a puddle of tears on the floor. My heart was broken and my eyes were open to the harsh reality of abortion. The experience that she described while working at Planned Parenthood shook me to my core. And she says, a fire was lit inside of me. I was convicted. Nearly a month later, she said, when I finally got the call that the role was mine, Organized chaos ensued. I needed to pack for 7 weeks and get on a plane within 5 hours, and that's part of that decision. They didn't want her to change it, and I guess she ended up in Oklahoma. That's right. I remember it was in the Midwest. It was Oklahoma on a Thursday, set to begin filming on Monday. Things happened so quickly that most of my friends and family had no idea why I had left. So when my mother called me on Saturday, I hesitantly answered, because we'd had a rocky relationship. I hadn't told her where I was or what I was doing, and I knew the project I was working on would make her emotional. Because, interestingly enough, Ashley Bratcher says, when I was in high school, my mother shared with me that she'd had an abortion when she was 16. She had been devastated by her choice, and 3 years later, she found herself in the same predicament. At 19, she became pregnant with me. And she told her, that is, the mother told Ashley, I knew I could never have an abortion again. That was the end of the story. It was a casual conversation. I never thought twice about it until it was time to explain the movie Unplanned. As I began telling Abby's story, I heard my mother fall apart. Her voice broke and she said, I need to tell you something I've never told you before. And through all these tears confessed, I was going to abort you. Ashley says, I sat there in silence, confused silence, as she continued. Her mother said, I was at the clinic sitting on the table when the nurse who was very pregnant came in to talk to me. I felt sick. I couldn't do it. I got up and walked out. Well, Ashley said, I didn't know what to say. I needed time to process what I just heard. It didn't make sense. How could it be possible that I was here telling Abby's story while never having known my own? Later that night, I called my dad, she said. It wasn't an easy conversation to have. I pleaded, is this true? Why didn't someone tell me? He confirmed the details of the experience. They agreed that they were too young to have a baby. We didn't have enough money, so I pawned a shotgun so that we could pay for the abortion. I saw in one of the interviews that Ashley did, she said, is that what a human life is worth these days? A pawned shotgun? Incredible story. I mean, this story is as good as the movie is going to be. Anyway, Ashley says, how could you tell your daughter that? When is the right time to tell her you were going to abort her? I don't know how to put words what it feels like to learn that you were seconds away from never existing. He sobbed on the phone. You being there making this movie is proof to me that God is so real that he has a plan for our life. Ashley said it's incredible and at times incomprehensible to me that this is my story. I'm so grateful that my mother believed my life was more valuable than the price of a shotgun, that the money intended to end my life was used to give me life. I'm grateful that God, through his providence, planted me here to tell my story and that I have a privilege of sharing this film with the world. And yes, I do secretly hope that one of the outcomes of all of these coincidences is that many will find the courage my mother found when she listened to her conscience and made the choice to give me life. If you'd like to join our conversation, love to hear your comments, but actress Ashley Bratcher is the star in this new movie, Unplanned. It will not be in the theaters till March 22nd, but because we have a relationship with some of the producers, maybe I'll get a chance to see an advance copy. I can't imagine how much more powerful the movie can be than this testimony of Ashley Bratcher, who finds herself in the film portraying Abby Johnson only after finding out from a strained phone call from first her mother, then her father, that they planned to abort her and had actually pawned a shotgun to have the money to pay the abortion clinic. And if nothing else, I think it just illustrates again that maybe there is a lot in store for this upcoming movie. Anyway, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, abortion and Planned Parenthood on the table. We come back, we're going to talk about slavery and the slave owner's Bible that's in the Museum of the Bible, which I think is interesting as a story in and of itself. We'll talk about that right after this.
This This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and so I thought we might reflect on the hymn, O Holy Night by John Dwight. O holy night, the stars are shining brightly. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. Jesus came into the world to save us, and so we feel valuable and our souls feel its worth. Perhaps the most quoted verse in the Bible is John 3:16. It tells us that Jesus came because God so loved the world. He came so that our souls would feel their worth to God. This hymn also asks us to consider the fact that the King of Kings was born as a human infant and placed in a manger. The King of Kings lay thus in lowly manger, in all our trials born to be our friend. He knows our need, to our weakness is no stranger. Behold your King, before him lowly bend. Isn't it amazing that there were some who were willing to worship him, even while merely a babe in the manger? This hymn then now talks about how we should respond to one another in humility. Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love, and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. You know, we no longer have slavery in this country, but it is true that many people are still enslaved to various forms of sin and need Jesus as their Savior. And we as believers are to model the humility that Jesus demonstrated when he stepped out of eternity into time and gave up his rights as God. This is a message we not only need at Christmas, but every day. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, so often here on the program we talk about sometimes people having a truncated gospel, a truncated worldview, even a truncated Bible. In other words, they only believe certain parts of the Bible, or they remove various verses from the Bible. Sometimes physically, if not emotionally, they do so. And so I thought for just a minute I might post, as we have on the website, this article that is by David Mills, because it relates to an exhibit at the Museum of the Bible. Now, last time I was there, they were just opening, so this may not have been there at the time. So the next time I get to Washington, D.C., I want to, of course, go back to the Museum of the Bible, which is just an outstanding museum. There is no way that I could say with more emphasis that if you are in Washington, D.C., and you're already going to the Smithsonian Museum and the Capitol and those kinds of things, you have to make it a point of spending, if you can, a whole day, but at least a very significant part of your day at the Museum of the Bible. And I might say, well, that'd be kind of boring, wouldn't it? I mean, just a bunch of Bibles. No, it's a lot more than that. This is what happens when you spend $500 million, $500 million on a museum with some incredible graphics, even a ride that the kids can take and takes you through Israel. I mean, it just is phenomenal what is there. But nevertheless, I digress. We've talked about the Museum of the Bible many times on the program, and we'll do so again. But David Mills says that on display at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., is a poignant, not to say shameful, historical curiosity. It's the so-called slave Bible from the British West Indies, an abridged version of the written Word of God meant to communicate only the essentials of the Christian faith. Now, he says it does kind of have the essentials, But when we notice first what is really left out, the editors have left out any verses which could be construed as critical of slavery. Those were deliberately disincluded. For example, the entire story of the Exodus from Egypt, for example, is not there as well. And there's a whole section, apparently, that he has provided, which is a link there as well on all the deletions from the slave Bible. So the point David Mills is saying is the abridging was done to create a Bible that masters would allow. Their approval was necessary to have the opportunity to present the gospel to slaves, and the slaves' Bible existence acknowledges the value of their souls, but that's not nothing. And you think this through for a minute. Okay, we want the slaves to accept the gospel, but we don't want them to see that slavery is wrong, so we're going to give them an abridged Bible, the so-called slaves' Bible, that they could actually read, but they wouldn't know, they wouldn't have the whole counsel of God, basically. Okay, well, back to David Mills. He says, however, it's impossible to address the soul sincerely while concealing known truths from the brain. Thankfully, we know better than to create a Bible pandering to the sensibilities of a powerful elite. No one does that anymore. It's just a memory. Or is it, he says. I'm afraid we have our own versions of the slave Bible, and that's why I wanted to talk about this for a minute. The slave Bible put the fear of man before the fear of God. It emphasized conflict avoidance, providing slaves no discernible quotes they might use to challenge masters. Hope for eternal liberty was censored out, even in the form historical precedent. The Bible's publishers were not men of wicked intent. They were pragmatic. They recognized how things are in today's world. These men strove to fit the gospel to contemporary sensibilities. They set the word of God to the tune of the times. After all, the Bible hasn't been written in a world of slaves, masters, and complex situations, had it? Of course it has. Actually, it had been. Yet, like all of us, the publishers saw their own times as demanding unique treatment. They needed a special Bible for special times, and they came up with one. But he says, but this abridged Word of God doesn't give us the full Word of God. Not only did it shortchange the slaves, it coddled the masters. Its implicit message to them was that the stuff which might prick masters' consciences was, after all, optional. By contrast, in the American South, where the slave Bible was never used, there was a rich tradition of slaves identifying with the Hebrews in ancient Egypt. Spirituals like Go Down Moses remain with us, evidence that slaves drew the obvious conclusions. So the point he was making is that that's the story of the slave Bible. But he also then takes it one step further, and I love this. Do we, modern Christians, have our own versions of the slave Bible? Yes, several. In 1995, the New Testament and Psalms, an inclusive version, was published by Oxford University Press. Its appeasement of modern sensibilities earned it the nickname, the politically correct Bible. Don't you love this one? As the publisher's description puts it, the Bible is designed to reflect a more inclusive, less pejorative view and to use language that emphasizes a universal community rather than a particular gender or other favored group. Pragmatic, some would argue, not to burden the basic gospel message with controversial content. You want modern people to listen to God's word? Don't offend them with unmodern parts. After all, the original Bible is simply not written in a sexually broken world shot through with predation, resentments, and delusions. And so one of the examples he uses is the so-called politically correct Bible. I would assume that most of you do not have that on your coffee table, but it is one of those. Another one, which I talk about oftentimes when I speak on the subject of homosexuality, is what is called the Queen James Bible. You've heard of the King James Bible. The Queen James Bible is actually one that is edited, quote, to prevent homophobic misinterpretation. And then it goes on to say, to do this, quote, in a way that makes homophobic interpretations impossible. And, of course, we've talked about that one sometimes before. Completely rewrites Genesis 19, 1 Corinthians 7, Romans 1, other passages. So, again, if you're a homosexual and you have homosexual proclivities, if you have same-sex affections and things like that, you can read that Bible so that it doesn't raise any concerns on your part. And then he says another step, probably in our fast-moving world, is to be a woman's Bible, which feminists will graciously allow. This new version will change all the teaching about men and women to fit feminist beliefs. Of course, now he's being a little bit sarcastic and predictive, you might say. Any teaching that suggests created differences, and especially any suggestion of any kind of hierarchy, will be cut out. One suggested upgrade will actually reverse the genders of biblical characters, a translation of sorts. Yeah, I haven't seen a transgender Bible yet, but I guess it's coming, don't you think? And then he goes on with one more. The step after that will be the progressive Bible, emphasizing left political causes. It will excise things that make leftist elites uncomfortable. These light translations will avoid pricking the conscience of the elites and will alter any biblical quotes that they might feel are inappropriate. And so he ends by saying it's the same old bargain. In other words, slaves in the West Indies, unfamiliar with the Bible, didn't know what was being left out. In the same way, young people in the modern West may well have the first interactions with a sanitized Bible meant to save their souls without helping them engage God's revelation in the context of the world. All these corrupted Bibles keep the soul on spiritual life support while abandoning the mind and brain to the spirit of the age. They extend salvation as a consolation prize while consigning body and mind to the miseries of the age. They may try to whisper the good news, but only while glancing over their shoulders nervously. He says, in short, while trying to do good by updating the scriptures, their editors are creating contemporary slave Bibles. Of course, with or without the undoctored Bible to back them up, people will still struggle against oppression, bondage, and lies. However, a doctored Bible denies them the assistance of Scripture and abandons them to make their own way. All they can do is protest sexual misbehavior and disappointment with feminist rage or feminist coercion with belligerent machismo. The ancient truths will actually give them a fighting chance against cultural forces. And the intact Bible's immediate relevance to our society also bears witness to the Bible's eternal promises. But a Bible that promises lies about this world won't inspire much trust in its message about the next. In another 2 centuries, I hope the new slave Bible will be obscure, embarrassing curiosities because they aren't in good news. Well, if nothing else, I just posted that one because it's a reminder, first of all, that we look back and say, how in the world could people possibly have condoned slavery? I suspect there may be a possibility somebody will look back, maybe lots of people look back, if indeed the Lord tarries, and say, how is it possible that even people sometimes in the church condone abortion? And yet, again, a lot of it has to do with the fact that sometimes we don't read our Bibles, or sometimes we have some of these truncated Bibles or even truncated gospel. And it's important for us to develop a Christian world and life view. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of the liberal mind. That is the first article here. Some very good material put together by Dennis Prager. And it also relates very much to the December issue of Outlook called Liberalism and Leftism. And if you haven't received your edition of Outlook, we would certainly want to make that available to you. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen. And one of the things I wanted to do is go to the first article we've posted here, and it is one that relates very much to the current Outlook articles that we have. If you are a donor to the ministry on a regular basis, you receive the Outlook magazine. This particular issue in December Liberalism versus leftism, what's the difference? Distinguishing between radically different political positions. And for just a minute, I'm going to quote from a little bit of one of the many articles in there to, in a sense, set up the article that I've posted today by Dennis Prager. And I do point out that even in that article, Dennis Prager is somebody that has kind of helped me educate me a little bit more, helped me really understand that when I use the word leftist and liberal, they are different. I've used them almost synonymously, the left and liberals, not necessarily. Or sometimes we talk about progressives. And so there's a lot of words there, but it seems to me that he's made, I think, a very accurate distinction between people that would be part of the so-called liberal tradition and those who are leftist. A couple of examples that we use in the article on the issue of race. The traditional liberal position is that race is really, or the color of a person's skin is supposed to be ultimately insignificant. By contrast, leftists argue that the notion that race is insignificant is itself racist. Liberals are committed and have been in the past committed to this idea of racial integration, but leftists on campus oftentimes want, separate black dormitories, separate black graduations, on and on. You can go through the long experience there. Free speech is a perfect example. We can and have had liberals on this program that agree with the classic statement, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Alan Dershowitz, I think, would fit into that kind of liberal idea that I may disagree with you, but you have a right to say that. And that has certainly been the position in the past of even like civil libertarians and the ACLU and groups like that. Leftists today, though, they're really sometimes on the forefront of trying to lead a nationwide suppression of free speech on college campuses, in the big tech companies, all sorts of things. And one more example that I'll use is nationalism, which we use in the article there. Dennis Prager uses a great example because he says, liberals always sort of pretty much believed in the nation state, probably one of the classic defenders of American history, Western civilization, the nation state, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and others. But leftists, on the other hand, they oppose the idea of nationalism and promote class solidarity. Now, the example that Dennis Prager uses, which I thought was pretty interesting, is Superman comics. Some of us old enough remember when the writers of Superman, when they were liberal, would talk about Superman was, the man who fought for truth, justice, and the American way. He was not only an American, but he fought for truth, justice, and the American way. But the left-wing writers of the Superman comics more recently had Superman announce that he was going to actually speak before the United Nations and inform them that he was renouncing his American citizenship. So I thought that was really kind of powerful in that regard. Well, with that as background, Dennis Prager has been writing a series, and this is Explaining the Left, Part 5. And I think it's important to recognize he's talking about the left, not all liberals. He's talking about the leftist ideology that I just kind of identified for you. And this is Part 5. I've got all parts 1 through 5, and you can read all of them. But he really starts out by saying that when I talk to young people, I try to offer what he received when he was young, and that was wisdom. He said, I was given wisdom largely because I went to a religious school. But he says, with the increasing secularization of our society, less and less wisdom has been conveyed to young people. One particular obvious example is most secular people, especially on the left, believe that human beings are basically good. It is difficult to overstate the foolishness of this belief, he says, and a belief it is. There's no evidence to support it, and there's overwhelming evidence, like virtually all of human history, to refute it. Jewish and Christian kids who study the Bible know how morally flawed human nature is by the age of 10. You think? But he says another thing I tell young people, which if they take seriously will make them immeasurably wiser, finer, happier, and more productive, is there's a daily battle between the brain and the mind. Now, the problem which you have is that more and more of these evolutionists and atheists are saying there is no mind. You're just a brain. You're just a meat computer. That's all you are. But most of us believe that there is a brain that our minds use, just like your hands use a keyboard on a computer, just like your eyes use a keyboard and a screen and a display for a computer. But we won't digress. The point he's making is the difference between, if you will, your brain and your mind. Your brain wants an ice cream sundae. The mind knows too many sundaes will make a person overweight and eventually diabetic. The brain, especially that of a male, wants sex anytime with anyone. The mind knows the trouble that's likely going to lead to. The brain is instinctive and feelings-based. The mind is thoughtful and can be reason-based. Tragically, he says, since the 1960s, the brain, that is, feelings and instincts, have been valued for more than the mind. And he says that explains why, for 40 years, I've asked high school seniors which they would save first if both were drowning, their dog or a stranger. And only about a third have voted to save the stranger. Their reason? They love their dog, not the stranger. The brain over mind. And he says, on the most important issue in human life, determining what is right and what is wrong, the brain, or feelings, has triumphed over the mind. At least 2 generations of Americans have been raised not with moral instruction, but with the question, how do you feel about it? Almost every left-right disagreement in American life can be explained by the brain-mind conflict. The brain is fed by what feels good, the mind by what does good. And the leftist positions, of course, feel good. It feels good to allow anyone who wants to enter America to do so. But if America is worth preserving, the mind understands that the right policy cannot be determined by feelings. It feels good to keep expanding government so that it can provide more and more people with benefits. But the mind realizes and recognizes this is a recipe for disaster because people become addicted to benefits and because the government assumes greater and greater debt it will not be able to repay. It feels good to lower admission standards to enable more blacks to enter prestigious colleges, but the mind knows that it doesn't help blacks. On the contrary, it hurts many of them, as does students of any ethnicity and race who are not prepared for the academic demands of prestigious colleges. And one of the oldest and most fundamental Jewish teachings, he says, is that every human being has 2 competing influences and impulses, the impulse to do good and the impulse to do bad. But then Dennis Prager says, when I was a young man, one of the leading rabbis of the last generation, Rabbi Wolf Kellman, told me something that changed my life. And he said, Dennis, I have become pretty good at keeping my, and this would be impulse to do bad, in check. It's my impulse to do good that gets me into trouble. Now, he uses the Hebrew words for it, but the point he's making is that sometimes when we want to do good, we actually do a great deal of harm. When we allow our emotions and our impulses to act very quickly, we regret those decisions. And frankly, even the whole structure of our government is based upon the assumption, as James Madison talks about, that you don't want to have this vigilante spirit. You don't want to have people motivated by factions and passions and things. You want to, every once in a while, slow the process down so people can think rationally about what they're about to implement as a rule, as a regulation, or as a law. But nevertheless, one of the things Dennis Prager ends his piece with is, even when propelled to do good, we cannot be guided by feelings. It's not only the human being that is driven by the conflict between feelings and reason, so is America. So this is one of the pieces that he has put together. I might just mention that one of the others that we've talked about in the past is part number 4, where he even talks about not only is there an emphasis upon feelings, but there's also what he calls a contempt for middle-class values, and uses a great illustration about this one law professor that gave just what we would consider to be pretty good common sense ideas about get married before you have children, strive to stay married for their sake, get an education so that you get gainful employment, work hard, avoid idleness, be respectful of authority, avoid coarse language. When she posted that as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, half of the law faculty condemned her simply because she was promoting what they call bourgeois values. And so even the things that you and I would consider to be just sort of basic ideas, basic principles of decorum and decency, those are being criticized and lampooned and are even seen as enough to actually ask for this particular law professor to no longer teach a required class at the university. It's a real battle between the left and the right, and if nothing else, these latest articles by Dennis Prager remind us of that. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Maybe it's the relentless ringing, the high-pitched clinging, or just the reminder that there's something to this season beyond ourselves, but some find the bell ringing a little annoying. At the end of the day, though, the Salvation Army bell ringers do good work. That's probably why Connecticut State Senator George Logan rings the bell outside of a Walmart in Naugatuck, Connecticut each year. This would be an otherwise forgettable act of kindness, except that one atheist group took their annoyance to a whole new level. They sent him an angry Christmas letter. But the letter was less concerned about the bell ringing and more upset that he would dare support an ostensibly religious charity. Rather than support what the group considers a, quote, church denomination, it strongly argued that Logan should focus his attention exclusively on secular charities. This, the group suggests, would solve any appearance of promoting religion and, quote, prevent citizens from feeling ostracized by their elected representatives. Well, if it's not clear to you, let me explain that the law does not require any elected official during his personal time to serve only secular charities. Indeed, the Constitution protects the right of every citizen, elected or not, to serve the charity or house of worship of his choice. The galling bigotry that this organization has evidenced toward the free exercise of this citizen is appalling, especially at Christmas. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have Nick Pitts with us, even though today is our kind of Wednesday roundtable for millennials. That sort of develops tomorrow, so we're going to have a great conversation. We've got 3 different guests, as well as Nick joining me around the roundtable, so I look forward to that opportunity, and I hope that you'll take the opportunity to find many of these articles that we have posted. The first one, Liberals, Brain versus Mind. The second one, which I'm going to talk about right now, The Death of Liberal Arts. The third, Slave Bible and Our Bible. And the fourth one, Actress in Unplanned. We're going to see if we can get her on in the future and maybe talk a little bit more about that upcoming movie on Unplanned about Planned Parenthood. But the second article I did want to spend just a little bit of time talking about. It is 6 pages long. There's no way I can even try, I try to even cover all of it in the next few minutes, but I thought I'd just give you a summary because it's a great piece to respond to some articles that appeared in The Atlantic. Victor Davis Hanson, of course, is a professor of classics. He teaches at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, has written quite a number of books, been on the program with us. But he says that the great culture wars of the campuses in the 1980s were lost, in a sense, by traditionalists. And the question then became not if, but when the liberal arts would die off as a result. What is strange, he says, is nearly 40 years later, it is apparent that the outrage over this was clearly foreordained is now becoming a fact. And the reason he brings this up is because of what has happened at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and also what people are writing about. Because the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point announced plans to drop liberal arts majors in geography, geology, French, German, art, and history. And so he points out that in The Atlantic, you've had two essays by Adam Harris, one called Liberal Arts May Not Survive the 21st Century, and then another one that was in the news. But nevertheless, he says the article's chief thrust is that this insidious effort to promote STEM vocation, what's STEM? Well, it'll be science, technology, engineering, mathematics, the need to prepare young people for careers requiring extensive math and science skill sets has driven out the need for more in-depth focus on the liberal arts. In a climate in which crass Republican state legislators in allegedly vindictive and short-sighted fashion demanded catastrophic cuts in state public higher education budgets. Well, we can stay away from the political stuff because what Victor Davis Hanson is saying is it's not this push towards STEM vocation alone, although that may be part of it, that caused this, because the title of his article is The Liberal Arts Weren't Murdered, They Committed Suicide. Okay, well, how does that develop? Well, I'm going to skip the rest of that particular page to get to my point. He says the tragedy is not just the campus of the University of Wisconsin would drop the history major, but the custodians of history in the 21st century lost the ability to teach and write about history in a way that sustained a hallowed 2,500-year tradition. In other words, Victor Davis Hanson says, what is being jettisoned is likely not just history as we once understood it, but rather these so de facto poorly taught studies courses, black studies, white studies, gay studies, lesbian studies. You've seen them. Okay. You get the point. Which sadly becomes snapshots of particular and often very small errors of history designed to offer enough historical proof of preconceived theories about contemporary modern society. If students are assumed by the course's end to be outraged, persuaded, galvanized, and shocked in politically acceptable ways. Usually they're just bored as supposedly with it professors endlessly regurgitate the esoteric picked up that they got in graduate school. Of course, he says not all historians see the past as an orthodox way of fixing the present, but enough do to discourage students, especially when younger faculty members draw on their rather specialized doctoral theses or narrow journal article expertise. But the point he's making is that if you've ever sat in some of these courses, you'd be appalled. And I think if parents did, they wouldn't shell out the money to send their kids to some of these schools. Here's just one of his quotes. He says, once a student has signed up for a class on the Renaissance or the Great Depression and quickly learns that it has become a periodic harangue on the oppression and victimization of particular marginalized groups, she will not likely wish to repeat the experience on money borrowed at between 5 and 7% interest, or be convinced that her future employer wishes to be woke by a heady 21-year-old. The irony about the Atlantic article that he's responding to is that it quotes liberal arts and history professors to document their outrage at the Wisconsin cuts. Their defense of their fields becomes perceptions of how history is necessary to advance particular contemporary agendas. So, for example, we're told that in mid-November, the university announced its plans to stop offering 6 liberal arts majors, including geography, geology, French, German, 2- and 3-dimensional art and history. The plan studied observers, many of whom argue that at a time when Nazism is resurgent in society, its needs for people to know history, even if the economy might not. And so stunned observers offering a touche to both Nazi apologists and right-wing money grabbers. But the point is, it's just talking about Nazism. And you can probably figure out which president is identified with Nazism. You figured it out. Okay, so he goes through a lot of other arguments about back and forth and Nazi and name-calling and North Korea and Venezuela and communism and history and everything. But then he reminds us of something. And that is, he says, 20 years ago, John Heath and I co-authored Who Killed Homer? The Demise of Classic Education and the Recovery of Greek Wisdom. And it was, as he said, a failed warning that formal university study of the classical past was dying off, caught between vocationalism or narrow specialism and politicization of both the classics curriculum and faculty research. In other words, he says again, at the very time it was becoming necessary to offer the university a counter-argument that liberal arts do enrich the education of business and tech grads and can make them both more aware as citizens and better managers and engineers, liberal arts faculty, in so many cases, narrowed their fields, employed off-putting jargon, and began to, of course, harangue their students. And you can see the rest of it. And so as a result, you can see why, first of all, many of the students say, we don't want to major in this. It's not going to advance our career. And you can see why a lot of employers, I love this, have privately concluded that today's graduating liberal arts majors are quite confident, yet so often poorly educated, or worse, those hiring were turned off by the strange combination of youthful ignorance and arrogance. Employers had clearly no desire to be enlightened by fresh graduates who were entirely unaware that their inductive skills were suspect or even non-existent. Great piece, and if you are concerned about the death of liberal arts, I think the premature death at the University of Wisconsin is just a preview of coming attractions, and there are some very good reasons why it. And Victor Davis Hanson warned about it 20 years ago, but nobody really should be surprised it's happening now, but it is. They can blame all they want, funding and the lack of interest in the liberal arts, but the liberal arts could have responded in the right way, but they obviously responded in the wrong way. You'll see more of those problems surfacing as time goes on, especially as parents no longer want to send their kids to schools that are just really there to harangue them about their middle-class values and to tell them that America is an evil nation. Young people might also want to just avoid those classes because they're not going to be prepared for the future with that kind of monologue that takes place every single day. Well, we're out of time. We will come back tomorrow with all sorts of very important issues. Want to thank Doug for his help behind the scenes. Want to thank Steve as well. And if you'd like to know some more, you can visit our website right here at Point of View.
When the going gets tough, paralysis can be deadly. You look around, you see all kinds of challenges and problems. Our country is greatly divided, red versus blue. At moments like this, the future belongs to those who trust in God and don't just complain and fret, but do something to make a difference. That's the spirit that has sustained Point of View Radio for over 45 years. People who saw difficult problems but recognize this ministry as a tool to equip people to make the right, bold moves. You make possibility reality. And when you give now, a generous friend has promised to double your gift up to at least $50,000. Whatever you give becomes twice as much. But nothing times nothing is nothing, so give generously. Investing is fast and easy online at pointofview.net. or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't let paralysis kill us. Make your next bold move now. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.